This is the PDK controller out of a 981 or 991. This sits inside the center console. It gets bolted to the center console, the aluminium frame. There's actually a black frame that sits over the top that needs to be removed so this can come out. The actual connector for the cable that goes down to the back of the car is this one here. When it's in the car, the cable would actually be stuck in there. To actually release it, you're going to push that forward and rotate that around. I'm not sure if you can see, but there's lots of notches in there, and the actual end of the cable has a whole bunch of notches. So it just sits in there. You need to put it in park and then actually have the gear lever, which is pulled rearwards as far as it can go in the car. So it's actually locked at the gearbox in park. You shove that in there and then just rotate that around and it's locked in place when you install. To pull this apart, you can, I guess, do it a few different ways, but the first thing I do is just remove the cover here for the electronics, just so we can disconnect those. The cover just slips straight off, and there's your electronic components there. To disconnect these, which you'll need to do to remove everything else, there's just a lever on each of those. This one's for the actual gear shift controller, and this one's for the solenoid lock. So just press down on that, and then you can just gently pull those rearwards. And they just come straight out. There's not too much to see on this, except that on the other side here, because the actual bit that actually controls the gears is on the other side here. I think it's these bits here, those hall sensors that are actually going to tell it when you're actually changing gears. And then I think it's probably best just to shove that back over the top to keep that all protected, unless you're actually changing something inside there. And then after that, to start dismantling all of this, I'm just going to pull off this. Is obviously the bit that holds onto the gear lever. There's just a ball in here, and like this one, it actually had a whole bunch of water go down through it. And the nice thing about the design of it is that everything inside floats, and then it can just drain out the bottom. So even though there was a bit of water coming out the bottom, the inside was like there was no effect on the electronics or anything. But because the ball had a bunch of rust on it, I actually needed to get two big screwdrivers to lever it off, but I've just put a bit of grease on it, and it should just pop straight off like that. And then to actually remove the bottom bit here, I'm going to remove these 4 screws around there. And once they come off like that, then at the bottom here, this is the bit that actually controls obviously that bit there slides back and forth to move that knob at the bottom, which controls the lever. It's this bit here when you're actually putting it back into drive. It's like that, and it'll lock it in place. And then there's a bit at the bottom here. This is the actual bit that's connected to the actual lever itself, and that gets moved across to there. And then this thing here, the springs inside here, which give you that feel when you're moving in manual mode. And then when you push it back to normal drive, it pushes that back in that position there, and now it can slot back and forth. Now to actually disconnect all of this, what you need to do is move it into drive, into manual mode, is the way everything comes apart. Now you get the solenoid here, which would normally be activated when you put your foot on the brake, etc. But this one down the bottom here, which actually faces you towards the back of the car, is actually the manual lever. So that does exactly the same thing, lifts the same lever inside as the solenoid at the other end. So if you remove the switch console here, you can actually see that. So if you're working on the car, say if you're putting your foot on the brake, etc., you can just do that. Obviously, then you can push that down and move it like that into drive. And I'm just going to move it into manual mode, and you'll see why in a moment. And then I'm going to remove the 4 screws here. And then this top here just comes straight off. It has some fingers that go down the side and hold the solenoid in securely. And then this thing here, the bit that actually does the gear shifting, those wires go in a little slot down there, so that can just be removed out of that. The solenoid itself, you can see there are 2 O-rings on the end of it. When it actually moves it, it's actually plunging in like that, so you can just pull that straight out, which is pretty simple. And you also notice that the manual lever, when I actually do that, it actually moves at the other end. The lever up there, so it does the same thing. But because it's now in manual mode, that just pulls straight out like that. That is that lever for the For the shift lock, for the solenoid, that can just come straight out. The one at the other end has some pins on there that you can pull it off if you really wanted to, but there's not much point in doing that. So you can see that it just does the same thing. And the reason it needs to be in manual mode is these little lugs here slot into down the bottom here, and if it's not in manual mode, they just get locked up inside and you can't actually get that out. So to install that again, you need to obviously put that down in there in manual mode. And then once it's like that, then you can slot it across and then it's locked in place. So let's put that into manual mode. At the bottom of these, there are these rollers that are covered in grease, and they go into these notches down the bottom here that give you the feel of when you're actually changing the gears. So when you're putting this back in, make sure because they'll just fall out if you put it like that sometimes. So put it like that and make sure they go in the right spot. And when you actually move it back and forth, you can actually feel those notching back and forth, and then you can put the cover back on again. Gear selection in the PDK is all done by hall sensors. The electronics box that sits there, there's a bunch of hall sensors on the other side, and that thing which actually slots into the PDK and moves back and forth as you move the handle. There's a magnet there which swipes along those. For the manual gate, so when you move it sideways into the manual gate, on this lever here, there is the hall sensor there, which is what those 4 wires are going to, and that slots in there, and as you move that back and forth, if you actually pull that apart, you'd see a couple of little hall sensors in there, and that's what determines whether or not you're actually in manual mode or not. Something to be wary of, or something to be aware of if you do pull this apart for whatever reason, is that this magnet here can just fall out, and its orientation is important. It fell out, just plonked it back in, and suddenly the manual gate wasn't working and it was giving me POS errors. So I'm not sure you can see, there's a little notch. There's actually looked like just a bit of a nick out of it. The other side's perfectly flat, and I'm not sure if that is deliberate or not, but that side up actually made it work, and the other way around stopped it from working.